Yeah, what's that?
Yeah.
Whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Let's get started. My name is Megan Delaney, and I am a patient advocacy specialist at J&J MedTech. So I have on today for you all some nice jeans, some really bright yellow shoes. Yellow is my favorite color. It looks horrible on me, so I put it on my feet. I have the J&J red event t-shirt, a jean jacket, and beach wavy dirty blonde hair. Right. So I am happy to introduce our HealtheVoices partners from Savvy Cooperative. Joining us today is Jen Horonjeff, who is the founder and CEO. Jen is a chronic illness patient by birth, a PhD by training, and an entrepreneur by necessity. Savvy was formed to ensure that the patient voice is heard and fairly valued, facilitating co-design between patients and healthcare innovators. In today's workshop, Jen is going to talk about the dynamic landscape of healthcare partnerships and the vital role of patients in shaping the future of industry towards a more patient-centered approach. Join me in welcoming Jen.
Yeah, okay, I'm not gonna do this. We went back and forth on if I'm gonna use a mic or not, but you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and I've got this streaming thing going on. You guys are probably better at that than I am, but apparently I'm able to be heard there. So thank you so much for that introduction. I am Jen Horonjeff, founder and CEO of Savvy Cooperative. I am sporting some jeans today, some white sneakers. That's a bold move when it's raining outside. A light colored shirt that says I am autoimmune savvy, which is true. I am a chronic illness patient. As she said, I grew up with several different autoimmune diseases. First diagnosis with juvenile idiopathic arthritis when I was just an infant. I just had a new rheumatology appointment the other day and had to admit that I was diagnosed in 1985 to her. So it's been a long time. I have a whole laundry list of other autoimmune diseases that I collected along the way, which many of you may empathize with. Had a brain tumor as an adult too, so the hits kept coming. But it's really what informs me doing the work that I do, probably much like you all, really wanting to be able to use your experiences and use them in a positive way, and in a way that honestly, not a lot of people understand. They have to have these lived experiences to really make innovations that actually matter. And so to tell you a little bit of my brief story, you heard some of my diagnoses. I actually was one of those sick kids that thought they were going to go to medical school and become a doctor, but I actually kind of became disenchanted with the healthcare system because I saw that my doctors were struggling to practice the medicine that they wanted to because of denials and adjourns and all that rigmarole. So I chose a different path, and I actually became a human factors engineer and human-centered designer, studying patient-centered outcomes and what matters to patients. And it was through that opportunity, working more in the professional space, industry and academia, and with professors and researchers, that I was able to talk to these folks. And they were great, fabulous people. They wanted to help patients, but they didn't have all the information that you all have living with your conditions or as a caregiver for people in your life. And so they were guessing. And guess what? Sometimes they were guessing wrong. And that's the problem, is if we don't actually know what the real priorities of patients and caregivers are, then things continue to get developed and maybe they're not as meaningful as we want. So that's really where we want to give the voice to those living with these experiences to be able to help shape and create the future of health innovations. And so that's truly where Savvy was born out of, is how can we actually make it easier for caregivers and patients to speak directly with these professionals. And that's what we do on a daily basis. But it took a while to get there. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is sort of like the past, present, and future of patient engagement. So where are we coming from? Gosh, I know that, some of you have been doing this a long time. Some of you, maybe you're newer to this sort of advocacy space. And it's interesting to think back over sort of the time that patients have been more involved in research. And I think back to some of the real foundational advocates and activists that helped get us to where we are. Truly, it was from an activism level is where sort of those first patient voices were actually being heard. This really goes back to the HIV and AIDS movement of the 1980s and having to demand to be heard because they were not getting access to the care, the medicines, treatments that they needed. And so I encourage you to go read up about these, brave activists and what they were doing to make sure that their voices were being heard. And then we started to see more and more happening since the 1980s. But again, long road, and do the math, some 40 years later, it's taken a while to get there to have this be more commonplace. And spoiler alert, we're not where we need to be yet, but we've made so many strides. And so in that time, there's actually been more guidance that's come through. Now, here we are in the United States. So our regulatory agency is the FDA, both for drugs and biologics, as well as medical devices. And different things have happened over that time that different regulations have come in. So I'll just name a few, but things like the 21st Century Cures Act, that was 2016. And that actually required there to be more involvement from patients. And that was through things like, if you've heard of anything like patient-focused drug development, also known as PFDD, there are meetings that are convened around a particular disease or condition, and they're convened specifically to hear the voices of patients and caregivers and to trying to understand what it's like to live with that condition. So those are things that can both be internally and externally held with the FDA to understand what the needs of that patient and caregiver population are. That then has progressed and different guidance has come out about like, how do you actually engage patients? And that's the thing, like even in the place that I sit and the kind of work that I do, people say, oh, well, how should we engage patients? What's the perfect patient engagement? And like, spoiler, there's no one thing. The way that I really think about it and the way that we talk about it, that if this resonates with you, feel free, but really thinking about patient engagement, not just being as a one-off, right? Patient engagement shouldn't just be a noun, it should be a verb. It should be something that's ongoing and iterative so that we can continue to learn from patients over time. It's not just the one and done and we feel good about ourselves because we talked to those people over there. We really want to make it a more active engagement. And so I talked about sort of on the drug side, the device side has similarly come out with other types of guidance about where patients should be involved in this process so that we can make things that like work. Like I was a human factors engineer as well. And what that means is trying to fit the world to the human rather than the human to the world and going like, well, this doesn't work. You ever get something and you're like, why doesn't it do the thing? Or I can't hold it. I'll tell you a story about that. If anybody's ever heard me tell this story, I just find it fun. In graduate school, I was part of a program that we would test out devices. That's what human factors is. Like, let's make sure they're usable. And this was for a syringe for a biologic medication. I won't name it. Has nothing to do with anybody putting on this particular meeting. And I thought that they were going to ask me to be part of this project because they knew that I have arthritis, I take biologics. And so wouldn't I be a great person to be able to be part of this project? I was not. Flash forward and I was put on this medication years later. And I thought, this is going to be the best injection of my life. That this is something that they tested. I watched them over in that other room that I wasn't a part of, but I know that they tested it. Okay, well, they must have tested it. I saw it happening. However, I couldn't hold this syringe the way that I would hold it based on where I would inject. So it was funky the way that it was designed. And so I couldn't hold it that way. So I had to kind of like sort of makeshift use it. Then the real kicker is, so the way that it had this like fancy little plunger situation, it did not fit in the sharps container I was provided. So I would take my Ziploc bag of syringes to my rheumatologist and have to drop them off in the office in a Ziploc bag that was not secure, rather than being able to put them into this container. So having to think through the entire life cycle of how something is being used is really important. So that's where, there is more and more guidance coming out to make sure that situations like that don't happen. But of course, we're still trying to play catch up in some spaces. Now, I mentioned I've been doing this for a while, savvy in its as its own entity, has even been around for 8 years and was doing this for much longer than that. And when I started this, I really had to, of course, convince people why the patient perspective was important. I'm happy to report that I don't think we have to do that anymore, especially given that there's, regulatory guidance that we need to hear from patients and caregivers. I think we've started to shift away from that. So we know it's important. Then I would say there's about a 10-year span of essentially companies kind of patting themselves on the back for calling themselves patient-centered. Everybody's website said, we're patient-centered, patient centricity, all this. They show you the little diagrams of the patient in the middle, and they put all the other stakeholders around them, like it's like a zoo and they're looking at you, right? So then we had the patient centricity sort of movement of just talking about it. And then you have to start to take steps to take action on that. And then truly, we have started to see more movement there. And it's come from maybe doing a survey one time, or talking to one patient advocacy individual that maybe didn't live with the disease, but is working at an advocacy organization, maybe as an executive director and is sort of liaising as that, but maybe doesn't have the lived experience themselves. So then actually talking with patients like you all, or caregivers or advocates in your space. And that's where we're starting to see this evolution of where do different people fit into sort of the development process of getting those different perspectives. So we're seeing that now. I think some of the other challenges, which we're going to talk about, was then making sure that patients are paid. And I'm going to tell you more about this and we're going to talk about it. But thinking again, historically, I was blue in the face trying to tell people that patients and caregivers should be compensated fairly for their time and expertise. And when I was that individual working, in academia and in the industry as sort of that patient representative, people will be like, oh, well, Jen, you're here and we're all just here donating our time. I'm like, you're a tenured professor, or you're working at this organization, you have to be here. It's good for your, resume to be publishing. But if we want to bring somebody else in that's having to take time off of work, I was talking to somebody the other day too, and they were talking about, here's an advocate or somebody that's, with a lived condition, and they were a lawyer. And so thinking about, as a lawyer, if they're being paid hourly, which they are, then that's certainly a hefty hour of time that they have to give up in order to share. Now, again, everybody's world is different. It doesn't have to be a lawyer. You could be working a different type of job, but yet you're taking time away. And if you're working for an hourly rate, that makes a difference. So we really need to make sure that we're compensating. I think this is a real diversity issue if we're not compensating fairly, because it means that there's a certain subset of people that they may be able to offer their time in, the way that kind of the structure of taking time off during a work day might be able to do, but maybe some people can't. And so whose voices are we losing in doing that? So just thinking about all of these things that we've been trying to talk about, and I thank you all for the work that you're doing in this space, hopefully carrying this torch. And hopefully through our conversation today, you might have some more tidbits to be able to go out and really advocate that your voice is being heard and valued as well. So let's talk through a little bit about, I didn't even have it on the right slide, guys. You should have just, said something to me. All right, just overview. Now you know what we're going to talk about. Spoiler. So we talked about this, about, where we're going or where we're coming from. So let's talk about kind of where we are. So now to kind of think about the different types of ways that you may be engaged and opportunities, and I want to share some examples with you in case that sparks ideas of where you can be sharing your voice or getting more involved. So like I say, and I mentioned through some of where were we in the past, we talk about drug development, talk about devices, talk about different digital tools. So that can be things like apps, wearables, different types of things. There's a lot of other types of monitors that people are using for different types of conditions or tracking things in something like a clinical trial. And then again, there's things that like marketing materials, different types of documentation, patient support materials. And, you ever read something and you're like, they have no idea what they're talking about. This sounds like jargon, or it doesn't resonate. It just seems, it just doesn't have the right language, all sorts of things. So to give you some examples of that, to kind of talk through several of these things. So let's talk about drugs, shall we? So let's talk about it through the lens of where within sort of developing out a medicine and then beyond would the patient perspective be helpful. Anybody want to share any thoughts? Has anybody shared their, yeah,
From the beginning.
from the beginning? Any other thoughts about like any specificity from the beginning? Any areas that maybe any of you have given feedback? Yeah, good.
How they talk about it, like what words they use, words that might be triggering the patient,
Right.
stuff like that.
Yeah, that's really important to understand that. Yeah, Barbie.
Asking the patients what they are trying to get out of the future treatment, what their goal is, the end goal.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up too. Understanding like what is important to you all, not just like people in a lab being like, let's make this molecule. And you're like, I don't care about what you're making. Yeah, back there.
Making sure that clinical trial sites are accessible for the patients that are going to be participating.
Absolutely. That's one of the hardest things is people being able to recruit for trials and getting people enrolled. You hear about people that want to participate and they're like, I can't access this site because it's not accessible. So thank you for that suggestion. Barbie, I'll come back to you. Yeah, go ahead, maybe. Sorry, quality of life. Quality of life, absolutely.
Patient-friendly language.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great. Oh, I love this. Yeah. Okay.
But also understanding, helping companies to understand the cultural nuances to whether or not people want to participate and how you work recruiting and engaging.
Yes. So quality of life was I'm just repeating just in case for the recording, and then the cultural aspects to make sure that these, whatever the materials or the product itself is inclusive of the people that are going to use it. Yeah, absolutely.
And then touch base off the mainstream earlier, diversity.
Yeah.
In the trials.
Absolutely, yes. To have all of this different types of like understanding what's important, making trial sites accessible, understanding cultural sensitivity, and then that's what's ultimately, among many other things, that go into making sure that we're making more inclusive and diverse products or services.
Continued access once the clinical trial stops before it's available to the public.
Yeah.
For the patient that it worked for, we need to be able to have access to that treatment ongoing, even if the FDA hasn't said, fine, you can use it.
Yeah, so, here being shared continued access to a treatment investigational, perhaps a drug or a device, once it's through a trial, what is it like for those participants, which is a really important thing to think about, right? We're not just studying on these individuals, they're giving themselves to this research. And so what are we giving back is always a really important thing to think about. Anything else? This is great. Yeah.
Well, language justice, we talk about cultural side.
Yeah.
Considering what I've worked on is making sure that Spanish.
Yep.
Spanish is understood from different cultures and different countries.
Yes.
It doesn't always flow the same.
Yes, so different sort of differences in language and culture and how all of these things are nuanced and therefore need to be appropriately thought about and tested and worked with patients and caregivers to get that feedback, because it's not a one size fits all. And certainly diversity doesn't just mean like slapping some images of, different people from different backgrounds and then just going to Google Translate and putting that on there as being the way of saying, look, we did it. So really more of a thoughtful approach. I think I saw, yes.
And I know someone had mentioned diversity, and they're showing, but also ensuring that you're having the right age group for what it's for, as well as in the right setting. So if it's not necessarily in a hospital,
Yes.
don't show someone in a Johnny who's old in the hospital if it's for a younger patient group.
Yes,
And they're
yes.
not in the hospital.
Oh, don't you hate those stock photos that you're just like, there's just some, large stock photography library of like sad clinical setting video or images, right? You're like, let's take that one, right? You're like, I'm enthused. So yes, absolutely. You need to think about the sensitivity of the imagery that's being used, making sure it's age, culturally appropriate, all of these different aspects so that it's actually fitting what you're trying to advertise for. Any other thoughts? Super good. Yeah.
Making sure that people are fully aware of what a drug trial entails. I was speaking to somebody about a drug trial, and they presented the fear behind being in a drug trial, when in reality that's not necessarily the truth, depending on where the phase is. So just kind of education, I guess, behind drug trials.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing from you, patient education, understanding how people feel about participating in a trial, because that's important. So that's excellent, even for us to kind of frame all of these things. we need to understand where patients or caregivers are coming from, whatever it might be. It might be fear, it might be excitement. Oh my gosh, thankfully there's a trial that, maybe has a new treatment that I wouldn't be able to access. But people are going to come at these things from all different levels, right? And so we need to help educate those companies and researchers and innovators in this space to understand all the multitude of complexities, because people are real people too. Like there's other parts of their lives that have to fit in. So when we think about sort of clinical development and what goes into developing out a drug, we've got to think about all of those things. So kind of thinking about sort of the progression there to sum up some of the things that I heard were understanding what matters most to patients and caregivers. So kind of that unmet need and the patient priorities. This is the kind of work I used to do in academia too. We used to redo what are known as like outcome measures, and like which things are we going to measure in a clinical trial? And I was that squeaky wheel. It was like, what about the patients and how can we measure those things? Because oftentimes they were just measuring what mattered to clinicians and pharmaceutical companies and regulators, but really needing to understand what matters to patients. And if you've ever heard the term shared decision making, meaning like, are you and your doctor working together to make this decision about your care? You can't do that if you all don't have the answers that you need about, making a choice. So if, here I am with all these autoimmune diseases. So anyone in the room living with an autoimmune disease probably know one of the biggest challenges is fatigue. And so they didn't actually used to measure that when they were measuring, going through clinical trials for drugs. So if you want to go to your doctor and say, well, here's option A and option B, and you say, hey, doc, which one's going to make me feel less tired? And they say, I don't know, because we didn't measure that in the trials. That's not helpful for you all. Then it's just trial and error, right? And you go, that was exhausting. Is the next one going to help? Is the next one going to help? But you just don't know. So that's why it's so important that we can even understand what we should measure. But then it's the how we should measure it as well. You ever fill out all those forms, those surveys? All the ones, the little check boxes in the waiting room, right? Like all of those things about like, how are you feeling today? In the past 7 days, have you X, Y, or Z, right? So those things are standardized. They take a long time to develop, and then they're used for like decades without any revision, right? And so that's why even thinking about some of the questions, I was, for one project, was using one recently to get feedback on it from patients. And what were some of the ones that people were laughing about? How easily can you pick coins up from a table? And people are like, coins? I don't use coins, I use Venmo, right? So they're like, I don't even use coins. It was like literally the question, how easy is it for you to use a touch tone phone? It says touch tone phone. And people are like, I've never used one in my life, right? So like needing to think about, are we even updating these things, right? So how are we measuring it? All the way through thinking about like a clinical trial. Like I'm glad we brought up sort of the accessibility of the site, but how often are you gonna have to go in? And is it every week? And, what does that look like? How often do you have to give blood? Is there a biopsy involved? Are you having to do images? Do you get access to the data or no? Somebody else is going to keep that. All of these aspects are really important to get feedback on from patients. And same sort of thing with, developing out a medical device, very similar process, but needing to understand, it might be that you need to wear some sort of, monitor that is being stuck on you. And we've had patients give feedback like, it was like my skin was ripping off. And you're like, oh, okay, well, if we had known, we could just make a hypoallergenic patch. Like that was the issue, is they were just like having sensitivity. And not that I want to belittle that, but if you knew that was happening, then they could have done something. So here's the kicker, is that when companies, like a pharmaceutical company, have to make changes during a clinical trial, it costs a lot of money to have to redo that, to slow down, to stop and make changes. So it is worth their while to be able to engage with patients and caregivers earlier on. Sometimes you still have to, give a little nudging that this is really something that's valuable. But that is why we're doing this, is because we're trying to get these drugs or therapies or devices, all of it, we're trying to get it to the market faster. But it's not going to happen if we have to keep stopping and going, oh, shoot, we did the wrong thing. So that's why this partnership, that's what, we really talk about. How can we co-create future innovations to be able to accelerate getting them to market and to the people that matter and solving the problems that actually matter? So to give you a few examples of other places, not just in sort of like the drug development space, but there's a lot happening in things like wearables and apps that, may be of interest to you to know about as well. I know that we are here, thinking through like drug and device development, but there are apps that are used either like with a clinical trial, with a certain medication. There are things like digital therapeutics, if you're familiar with that term, which is like a prescription app that you could actually use for certain types of conditions that goes through a similar sort of process to be approved. But getting feedback from patients on apps and things like that is really important too. Does it make sense? Is it usable? What's the language like? Is it accessible? From an accessibility standpoint, we have people giving feedback on apps or saying like, I can't use this here. My screen reader is happening, on my desktop, and I use other sort of assistive devices. So all sorts of different things. We find that patients and caregivers really love giving feedback on like actual tangible things. I know sort of marketing or types of material was talked about, Cody was sharing about like the language that's being used. So like really getting feedback on that. At Savvy, we do a lot of these types of projects and working with different types of like marketing materials. I'm always fascinated to hear the feedback from patients. I'll never forget one. I won't say, I can't even remember what it was even for, except for the fact that I know it was in kidney disease. And it was this picture, it was a little cartoon. And it was like somebody like pushing a kidney, like it was a boulder up a mountain. And the feedback from patients was like, are you kidding me? Like, that does not paint me in a good light. I do not want to feel like that is my life. It's exhausting. We also had another campaign that was photographs, and there were beautiful photographs. However, it was photographing people sort of like in a shadowy sort of lighting. I'm not a photographer, but the lighting way that it was, and for this particular condition and the sort of community that it was hitting, they were talking to the community and they were just saying like, this is offensive. Like, I don't want to feel like I'm in the shadows and in the dark. Like the way this language is and the way that I'm depicted, like, I don't feel like you understand me in my community. So we certainly don't want to be offensive. Like you want it to resonate, but definitely don't want to turn people off. And the same thing can happen with language. So understanding the language that patients and caregivers are using to talk about the condition, so you feel like you actually have a connection. I was part of a project that was reviewing different types of commercials for, the ones that you see on TV, and different types of like concepts there. And I thought one of them was really interesting. That was like, even having like, what do they call it? Like, breaking the fourth wall, third wall? Fourth wall. Okay. That's like, the actors in this commercial, even as like the narrator's on, like listing all of their different, side effects of like, where they're like, and you might get, and they're doing that. Like then the actor being like, wait, and kind of talking sort of to the folks that were watching the commercial. It was really interesting to hear the feedback from patients being like, that feels more real to me. Like, that's really interesting that they're actually like acknowledging that, not just like, skipping through flowery fields or something while that stuff's happening. So really getting sort of that feedback in a lot of different ways. So hopefully it starts to give some, sense of where you might be thinking about getting involved, using your voice. And what's interesting too for me, in kind of the role that I have, is I go to a lot of these professional conferences and share some of these things, right? I'm like, oh, we worked for the company and they did this type of project, or they were like, testing out prototypes of a device and getting feedback from patients. And afterwards, like even somebody that might be on the panel with me, they come up and they go, I didn't even think about getting patient feedback there. So that's what a lot of this is, just like helping to level set that like there are plenty of places. Really, it's everywhere. And it's really about now, how can we actually operationalize it so that people don't not do it, right? Like that's what I think there's a lot of like, oh gosh, well, we don't have time, or we don't have the budget or whatever. But that's what we really need to help empower you all to be able to sort of make the case for why that really matters. And I think just like understanding, and this is the way that we talk about it and frame it too, is there's a business case there for them, right? I said, like, if that drug takes an extra month, an extra year to come to market, they're losing a lot of money. So you want to say, okay, well, what if we took like another week or a month to talk about this? Like that is worth it for them. So there is a business case. We kind of joke, and I think I wrote a blog about it years ago about like you pay now or you pay later, right? Like you invest the time and effort and money up front, or it's really going to cost you down the line. And truth be told is there are products and services and outside of just like the drug space, but you think about all those apps, right, on an app store that are like supposed to be helping you with your health or well-being. How many of them actually succeed, right? And that like, this is such a disservice to patients because if they're not getting that, like there's so many people out there just wasting time and money. They purport to want to help you all, but how are they going to do that if they just don't listen? So we really need to make sure that this is something that is, talking about the past, right? That now the FDA says you need to do it. And so people say, okay, I did this one thing, and we need to make sure that they're going to keep coming back over and over again so that this becomes commonplace. So when I'm giving this presentation in 5 years, we get to put that part in this. What we just talked about is going to be in the past slide, right? And then we're going to talk about all the cool ways that we can be working with patients going forward. All right. So speaking of, and checking my time here. All right. So thinking about like, where are we going and how are we actually doing this? So you heard about a lot of examples, but now it's like, how? What is that like? So, I know that many of you are, advocates, influencers, consultants, working with advocacy organizations. And so the question is first, like, maybe like, how do you even find some of these opportunities? And that's where, obviously there are organizations like mine that, post these different opportunities to get involved. But I imagine that people are reaching out to you. If you're out there and you're putting yourself on social, you're probably getting people saying like, hey, so you did this thing. Would you share my product on your website? Or would you mind coming in and talking to my team? Oh, by the way, like, I don't have a budget for this, right? Like, oh, we'll send you the product for free. All of these kind of things. And look, as I was a poor grad student and a startup founder, I understand budgetary constraints, but that's where I think for you all to kind of like put on your thinking cap and like weigh out what feels right for you. The way that I really talk about it is through like, what is equitably valuing a patient or caregiver? So that could look different, right? Like you talk to a big pharmaceutical company, budgets are different. But if you talk to like a small startup or maybe an academic or, that PhD student that's trying to like, move some research along and they say, would you mind talking to me for my, my dissertation? Then you can say, okay, on an individual basis, what feels right to me? And do I feel like if I talk to that grad student, that's something that I really want to help like invest in the future of the next researchers. And then when they're at that pharma company, they can pay me the big bucks. You can make those decisions. I know I make those personal decisions as well about like, what feels right. But I want you to know that your time and expertise is valuable. So whatever that value is, you might say to that grad student, like, I'm so glad I can help you with this. I would love to hear the results of your research. Could you share that back with me when you're done? Now, grad students, that might take them another 5 years, but they'll get back to you, right? But like thinking about that of like, what is the value exchange? So it doesn't always have to be monetary. So I don't want to belittle those folks that are saying, here's a product, you can give it to you for free. But that's what, again, is that product valuable to you? And the answer is yes, then that might be a great value exchange. But if it's not, like thinking about what that balance is, because you do have negotiating power. So let's talk a little bit more about compensation. When you work with a company, like a pharmaceutical company, it is likely that they are already going to have what's known as their fair market value, or an FMV, which means that they've already said internally, this is how much we are going to pay for this. So you might say, I charge $1,000 an hour. And they say, oh, well, we can only pay $100 an hour. It's going to happen. And believe me, it's a struggle to try to get them to change. Now, I will note that some companies have differences in how they compensate, more of an advocate, an expert, like consulting level individual versus a patient that may be, participating in something like a one-time 60-minute interview or a focus group. So you may ask about what their rates are, and they are set. So they should be telling you honestly, but that's something that we're trying to drag them along, but some of their rates may be really low, and then they redo them every 5-10 years, and then they jump up. But just be aware that no two companies are probably the same either. So it might be something you need to ask about what is their fair market value. But again, if you are working with those like pharmaceutical drug medical device companies, they probably already have something set. So it's a good baseline. Like, don't feel like you have to negotiate. You can just ask. Like, what is your fair market value rate for this? Because I know that's one of the things that people like toil about is like, what should I charge? Because you should charge something. And I know that can, feel like, well, I don't want to overcharge and then not work with them, right? Like, but it also shouldn't be a race to the bottom to only work with folks that are going to charge $10 an hour. That's not what we want. So it is something that you may start off. And if they come back and say, well, we really want to know what you would propose, that's another thing. You might also be involved in projects that you might just have sort of a set fee, a rate of this project. You're going to pay $2,000 to be involved and advise in these different things. Then you should do some math and try to understand. And you should ask them, what are the expectations of me? How often are we meeting? Because that's the whole thing, right? If they're like, oh yeah, this is for like 4 2-hour calls or something. Like this is for, once a quarter, we're going to meet for 2 hours. And you're like, okay, it's pretty good. But then are they going to keep asking you to hop on another call of like, oh, can you just chat real quick? And the next thing you know, it's another hour, it's another hour, it's another hour. And you get this sort of scope creep. That's when then all of a sudden, right, your $2,000 getting, much smaller. So that's when you think about like engaging with individuals. You want to know exactly what's being asked of you. Up front, there's likely a contract. So you want to know and you want to make sure that's going into it. If you are contracting directly with that type of company, it will be in there and you want it in there because it's protecting you. Now, here's the flip side. If you say you're going to do that, you need to do it. So that's the challenge, is sometimes that you need to follow through. It's also something that I feel very passionate about when we work with companies, helping to connect patients to these opportunities is, look, we are patients ourselves. And so therefore things come up. I was running a prep call for a project just the other morning. And one of the participants that morning had to say, I just had treatment and I feel like garbage. And so I can't make it. Totally fair. I have no problem with that, right? Like, let's be realistic, but just making sure that you feel like you can have like an honest working dynamic with this company, individual, team, and being upfront about that. And hopefully they should be understanding. But, if you are signing up in this way, it's something that you all as professionals should be mindful of too, of just following through with those kind of things. You should be reading those contracts. They're long, lengthy documents, but there's a lot in there. Please let me illuminate some of the things that could be in there for you. Some of them might say that if you're doing something like a video call or it's being recorded, that it's just easier for them to put in language that gives them as much possible coverage as possible. And they might say something like, they have the ability to use your likeness royalty-free worldwide in perpetuity. What does that mean? Your face could show up on a Facebook ad and they don't have to pay you squat. So you really want to make sure you read those things to understand what is it in there. It's something that at Savvy, we typically speaking, our projects with our clients are all for like internal use only, unless it's like specifically specified that like you're going to be on a Facebook ad. Or maybe your video or image is going to be on a branded or unbranded website, meaning like maybe you're on a drug website. But wouldn't you like to know if you're going to show up on that drug website, hoping to sell that product? And that's something where, again, if we come back to this concept of what is a fair, equitable value exchange, it's probably not going to be that like $100 an hour that you made. It took you an hour to film that video. Probably worth more than that to be on that website, right? So just thinking about those aspects. So I'm not here to tell you what exactly is right for you, just the kinds of things that you really want to understand. And even in sort of both the contracting on like the legal document, but really it comes down to like, how are you talking to whoever you're working with and setting those expectations? They're going to have expectations of you because if they're going to pay you, but you should have expectations of them. So if they want you to create content for them, you should have something in there, or at least discuss with them. I can only do my job if you make sure you get me the information that I need on this timeline. You can't give me this creative or whatever talking points and then have me expected to produce a video for you the next day, right? Like that's not valuing your time. So just making sure that some of these things are really put down so that everybody kind of knows. And also know that all of this is sort of up for conversation along the way. You're not locked in. A lot of the time people might contract you for a certain time period. If something's going awry or doesn't feel right, use your spidey sense and speak up and talk to somebody. You really need to, if you're not working through another organization, you need to advocate for yourself because that's just a life lesson. You need to really make sure that you're looking out for yourself. So just a few things to think about when you're working in these sort of ways with different companies. I want to make sure we have a little time if anybody has any thoughts, questions before we close out here. Yeah, go for your first.
Do you have any tips on how to like spot out any scammers
Oh.
out there?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think again, like asking up front all of these kind of details. Is there a particular use case that you're thinking about?
No, I mean, I just think, for example, I got a private message